Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. I'm an analytical hypnotherapist as well as a psychological astrologer. And I am joined today by a wonderful herbalist, Marcos Patchett. Hello, Marcos.
No, no, no. Hi, Emma.
You are here to talk about a book. And given that this episode of In the Light is pretty much Christmas season, it is called The Secret Life of Chocolate. So for regular viewers of this channel, it might come as a surprise that we're talking about something that appears so lightweight as chocolate. I thought that it was fascinating because it's, let's call it a herb.
Yeah.
Let's herb because it has uses that are both of the body, the mind, and let's throw in spirit as well.
Yeah.
So I couldn't resist this. So okay, you tell us, why chocolate?
Fair enough. So why chocolate? Well, I mean, where should I take that? Well, firstly, I guess the book's called The Secret Life of Chocolate because everybody knows chocolate, right? But obviously the book actually features cacao, mainly the plant, so and the cacao ceremonies have got really sort of big and bougie in the last few years and sort of like a sort of very Instagrammable sort of phenomenon of late. But the plant has a very, very ancient sort of a very long lineage of use sort of in Central America. It was originated, the plant Theobroma cacao, in South America, and then it was cultivated for several thousand years in Central America, and the seeds were toasted, made into a drink and whatever. So why chocolate? Firstly, because why I wrote a book about it. Firstly, because hi, my name's Marcus and I'm a chocoholic. Do you know what I mean? There's that one. Secondly, as a herbalist, I'm interested in medicinal plants in general. And cacao is my favorite, shall we say, psychoactive substance. It's the thing that I like best to sort of alter my mood. I don't take it every day. I say I'm a chocoholic. I have cacao about twice a week, but it is one of the things that I would not want to give up. I mean, I can. I've gone without it for a couple of months, which does sound a bit like one of those smokers who say I could give up anytime. But the good thing about cacao is that it is, for most people, nothing is actually a panacea, but apart from maybe oxygen if you're alive. But in terms of substances, very few things are. But cacao is pretty good for you, which I'll get onto. But so the reasons I wrote the book: I like chocolate. I'm a herbalist. I'm interested in plants. It's one of my favorite substances, and also it comes from a part of the world where I've always been really fascinated by the history of Central America. So the Mayas and the Mexica, the Aztecs as they're known, and all that, they were one of the first sort of civilizations, ancient civilizations, that I was utterly fascinated by when I was at school. So just the fact that this substance originates there, and that it was what we now eat as chocolate with sugar as a confectionery, originated as a beverage made there, usually mixed with other plants and spices, as the most valued beverage in the country, and it was used secularly, medicinally, and ceremonially, and still has some of those uses and resonances in the culture there now. So it was really, so the book is, I've described it before as a series of Trojan horses made out of chocolate, like a nested series, like Russian dolls. Do you know what I mean? So you've got like sort of the outer shell is just like chocolate, and then inside that there's another smaller one which is about complementary medicine, and then inside that there's the one about sort of magic and sort of traditional lore, because I think you can do that with any substance or thing really, but chocolate's just a very pleasant vehicle for investigating some of those ideas.
Just listening to you, something that I wondered was how, because you were talking about the chocolate we eat being very different, how is the chocolate that we know today different from the chocolate that they were using then?
It's very different. Firstly, there's obvious, the form of it is different. So firstly, that was mostly, almost universally, a drink. It was a liquid, and that's not quite like, it's different from coffee. Because I mean, this, if I'm being technical here, I describe it in the second chapter of the book, which is about the historical forms that chocolate has taken. So because I've divided the book into 3 sections. The first bit is about the history, just like the first couple of chapters. The middle bit, which is the sort of densest bit of the book, is about the sort of pharmacology of chocolate. So there's a bit about the Renaissance apothecary uses and its traditional uses, then loads about the pharmacology, the chemistry, and the research into it, including some stuff about how chocolate interacts with society, and the chemistry of love, which I find really interesting, because, you know, chocolate on Valentine's Day, does it actually have any effect on the brain chemicals involved in forming relationships? And I think yes, it does, which is interesting. So then the last section of the book is the last 2 chapters is on the sort of metaphysics of cacao. So that's like it's traditional, the mythology in Central America, which incorporates it. So in the first bit of the book on the history, second chapter is all about the different forms it's taken in history. So I describe chocolate, traditional cacao drinks in Mesoamerica, as being like a suspension, infusion, emulsion. It's a combination of 3 things. So something like coffee is or tea is an infusion, because plant material, hot water, an infusion. Cocoa that is made from cacao is a suspension, an infusion. It's particles suspended in water, but also it's an infusion because the plant material is extracting out. I'm trying to think of plants that make emulsions, like lots of coconut milks are emulsions. I was thinking of kava kava, the Polynesian sort of psychoactive drink that you go to Fiji or whatever, they drink it in. That's an infusion emulsion where the fats from the plant are mixed with. And cacao is all of those things. It's an emulsion because it's got a very high fat content. It's like a nut. It's like when you grind the cacao, so you toast the seeds, you shell them, you grind them to a liquid because they're 50% fat. So it's like making a nut butter, essentially. You grind them, and then that nut butter, which is called cocoa liquor, is mixed with the hot water or room temperature, tepid water, and frothed up. And so you've got the fat from it making an emulsion, you've got the ground up seeds actually suspended in the liquid, and it's infused. So it's the traditional drinks were drunk either hot or tepid, room temperature, made with the seed of the plant, usually frothed up with additional plants added for flavoring or sometimes for medicinal effect. And some of those plants, I think, were foaming agents. So it completely different from modern cacao. And the other way that it was different, another really important way, because there are several, but one of them was that they were often bitter. Those drinks were often bitter. They were not sweetened. Some were. The Maya have sometimes added honey. We know that because they have different. There are Maya ceramics, which have, because obviously the Maya, uniquely in Central American civilizations, had writing. They had hieroglyphic writing, so or pictogrammic hieroglyphic partly. And they have vessels which still survive, which we know were used for storing cacao because they have cacao written on them, and they have different forms of cacao. So they had like cacao with honey, or cacao, pink cacao, green cacao, tree fresh cacao, all these different kinds. We don't even know what most of them were, but there were obviously hundreds of different beverage recipes, and many of these would be prepared, say, in advance of a feast or a banquet or whatever, and then just left in the vessel. They've got this amazing lock top vessel from like 600 BC, which is fantastic, like ceramic, handmade with a thread, so the cap locks onto it for storing cacao in. So anyway, I digress.
No, that was a wonderful digression. I'm just listening to you and thinking about the difference, and I'm thinking about the medicinal properties of cacao.
Yeah.
And is the way that we're enjoying chocolate taking away any of the medicinal qualities of the plant? Because leaving aside the sugar, I mean, dark chocolate is bitter.
Yes. No, it's a very good question, Anna, and I think the extent is well, in my view, yes. Is it ruining it? Is it completely negating the, just on a purely physical, materialistic, pharmacological, chemical, rationalist, like modern scientific level? It is diminishing it somewhat because um, you're usually with the traditional beverages, they're just made from the toasted beans mixed with water and sometimes other spices. So you've got a higher percentage of those antioxidants like the polyphenols in the plant, and you have less added fat. And as you've already mentioned, that the sugar, although leaving it aside, but we can't really leave sugar aside because it's actually a very large part of chocolate, isn't it? I mean, it's like even dark chocolate, like 85%, oh, bitter, 15% of that is sugar, right? That when the percentage in chocolate, the remainder is sugar. That's like, and then of that percent, say an 85% chocolate bar, dark chocolate, actually say another 20% of that will be added cocoa fat, added, which is not the worst kind of fat. It's got a bit of saturated fat in it, but it's mostly non-cholesterol raising or whatever, but it's pretty neutral. It's just fat. And then the bean itself, because it's quite a high fat seed, is 50% fat anyway. So just by default, the eating chocolate is going to have less of the good stuff in, and just more caloric value, and the bars are going to have added sugar, whatever. When you get to milk chocolate, the milk powder, or the milk proteins rather, actually slightly reduce the absorption of some of the antioxidant polyphenols. Not massively, but the polyphenols do bind to milk, and so it reduces the absorption. We know this because there have been trials with human volunteers after eating chocolate, stuff like that. And then the third factor is obviously the length of processing time. When the beans are industrially prepared, they're usually roasted in giant ovens, so they're uniformly roasted, which reduces the level of polyphenols a bit more, I would say, than when they're toasted on the, like in the traditional manner. When they're toasted in an open, usually traditionally on a clay dish, or just over an open fire, gently, until they sort of start to pop, and then you take them off and shell them. If they're uniformly roasted in big ovens, it's usually a bit of a higher temperature and a bit longer. And then for making chocolate for eating, they're usually conched, which is a conch is a giant, it's not a shell, it sounds like they're putting a sort of seashell, I don't know, but no, it's a giant machine where they are, once they've been roasted and shelled, which is obviously done mechanically in industrial processing, they're then put in these conches, which are giant troughs, essentially made of something non-reactive like granite or ceramic or metal or stainless steel or something, and then they're beaten with rollers for sort of 48 to 72 hours just to make the cocoa liquor as smooth as possible to get a really nice mouthfeel. Now, if you're doing that with whole beans, and this is the level of like detail I'm just obsessed with it, so I've actually looked into all this. Because the beans contain a lot of fat, even though they're being beaten, so air is being beaten into it in a sense for up to like 3 days, the fat in the beans protects a lot of the antioxidants from the air so that it's not oxidized that much. But what you do lose is a lot of the volatiles, like a lot of essential oils and a lot of some of the acids produced during fermentation. Now what that will do is it will refine the flavor, it will make the flavor a lot mellower, which is why it's done. It's to decrease the particle size so that when you eat chocolate it just melts, and it also is to get rid of some of the acids and the sharper flavors, whatever. But in so doing, you're reducing the pharmacological complexity and the sort of fingerprint of the cacao, if you like, a little bit. So you are losing things, yes. Are you losing everything? No. Does it become medically inert? No. Is eating chocolate a slightly different animal than traditional drinking chocolate? Yes. Traditional drinking chocolate, when it's made, when you make it yourself, particularly when you get a really good variety bean from Central America and it's not overly toasted and you hand grind it yourself on a metatati, it's another level of thing than like I call chocolate bars methadone. They're my methadone. If I can't get like traditionally made drinking chocolate, then okay, fine, I'll just buy a bar that's like dark chocolate or whatever. It's nice, but if you have a good cup of traditionally made chocolate, then that really lifts you. It's got a noticeably a noticeably more powerful effect, depending on how sensitive you are to cacao, because people vary.
So essentially what we're saying is there is cocoa, and then there's refined cocoa, which is what we enjoy as chocolate.
Yeah, but technical point, Anna. Cocoa and cacao. This is where the language gets. Because cocoa is usually referred. That term usually refers to the sort of powdered, defatted seeds. So it's like when they've got the seeds, they've roasted them, and then they press the fat out. So it's storable, and then it can just be mixed with water to make an easy drink. But the cocoa is the lowest quality of all the cacao products. It's great for baking. I'm not knocking cocoa. Cocoa is fantastic, but it's the lowest quality, because once you press the fat out, then the antioxidants start to oxidize much more quickly. It has about half the levels of the polyphenols, which are the sort of the brown stuff in cacao, or the substances which contemporary research has shown reduces inflammation in blood vessels and reduces the risk of diabetes. It does all sorts of little interesting things incidentally to the brain chemistry, which I might get onto. But it has much lower levels of those. But it also has a milder, blander flavor. That's cocoa, and cocoa can produce a couple of different ways. You can either just press the fat out, or you can do the traditional method, which was invented by a Dutch guy called Mr. Van Houten in the 19th century, where you add potassium salts, I think, to it, and they basically, it's the same principle as when you add an alkali to a fat to make soap. You don't add loads of it, you add a little bit, and any remaining fat in the seed is saponified, so it just means it stops it clumping together, and means when you stir the powder into water, it more easily makes a drink without you having to do anything really. But it also further reduces the polyphenol levels in whatever. It further sort of denatures some of the healthy compounds in it. Cocoa is still a relatively healthful drink, I would say, but it's a level down from eating chocolate, even though eating chocolate might have some added sugar and other bits. And then and that's about 2 levels down from the actual seed, so.
Okay. I'm just trying to, okay, well, let's go. I was trying to decide which direction to go in here, because I have 2 questions. So if we're thinking then about the best way to eat chocolate, the beans obviously are your top choice.
Yeah, made into a drink, ideally.
Made into a drink. Is there something in between the beans and, let's say, a bar of dark chocolate?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you can get blocks of couverture, which are just ground, the roasted, shelled, toasted beans, ground up into a liquid and then solidified. So you can buy these now. You can buy them made from all sorts of different beans, like on the internet, sometimes for ceremonial cacao, and you can just grate those blocks into a jug or whatever, or a bowl, and pour on your boiling water and whatever spices you want, cinnamon or vanilla or whatever, and a bit of sweetening, and just whisk it and make your own really quality sort of actual hot chocolate from those. So I'd say those are intermediate. The highest level, which I've sort of like put in the middle bit of the book, I've got a little recipe section in there in chapter 8, it's called the formulary, that describes how to make all the traditional drinks. Now some of those you need like fancy ingredients that are only found in indigenous Mexico, or Guatemala, so you'd have to go there to get them, but some of them are just, you can make with ingredients you can get here. A few with a little bit of research, some of them everybody has, so everybody, but it's a bit like making your own bread, right? It's the same principle. It's pretty labor intensive, but it's worth doing, because, and you can mess it up like making your own bread. Do you know what I mean? It's like the first time I tried making bread, I sort of ended up with sort of an inedible brick. So with cacao, I think it's not as fussy as bread. If you follow the steps, you'll get something drinkable, but you will have to play with it, and it's a substance that requires some work. you know, at every level of processing, but it's worth doing because the quality is so much higher. But if you can't be faffed with all of that, to your question, Anna, I think you can buy blocks of this stuff, and I'll maybe send you a link. There's a friend of mine, Daya, who I've worked with in the past. She runs a little company called Cacao More that sells blocks of this stuff, and I've got a discount code for her product. But there are other equally good products. There's like there's Willie's Cacao. He does some Willie's Supreme Cacao. He does blocks for cooking, but it's actually single estate, just cocoa liquor. So it's just the beans that have been ground and then solidified into a block, and then you can add your own spices and sweetening or whatever. So.
Well, that sounds absolutely delightful.
Very nice.
It really does. Okay, so you've kind of mentioned some benefits, but I think it's time to get a little bit more explicit, or a lot more explicit, about the benefits of chocolate. Yeah. Why all the fuss? Why was it so incredibly revered in Central America, and why has it persisted? We can see why we like it. Clearly, it tastes wonderful because we actually refined it and done all sorts of things to it. But they didn't do that. So they must have known that there was more to this than, you know, the flavor. Yeah. So what's with it?
Interesting question, and one where, I mean, that like the book took me 14 years to write, I should say. So all of this is covered in some detail in here. So I'm not going to be able to recount the whole thing in this interview, but I'll try and give you some angles and bullet points on it. So why was it so revered? Well, let me try and work backwards from the time of the Spanish conquest, in a sense. So there's a famous sort of passage by a famous little quote. I use it in the book somewhere, which is kind of hilarious, by one of the early, I guess you'd call colonists of Mexico, because he wasn't one of the conquistadors. He was Italian, so he sort of came after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Girolamo Benzoni. And in his diaries, he recounts going to one of the native, they called them Indians, because, you know, following Columbus, you know, that whole mess where they were aiming for India and there was a continent in the way and all that. So he recounts being offered a drink of foaming cacahuatl or cacao by a native Indian. And when he first arrived, and refusing it. And this native, he describes him as going away laughing. Like, because the Indian had sort of offered him this prized drink, and he'd gone, no, I won't have that. And the Indian just laughed in his face and walked off, just thought, idiot, you know, why not that? But then he says, you know, after a while, being unable to get wine or growing tired of wine or something, I did as the natives did and started to drink this cacao. And he said it is, I can't remember the word exactly, but he said something like it's cooling and satisfying, and it's cooling and both satisfies and refreshes the body and mind. So I think from that little anecdote already there, you can see it encapsulated that the indigenous population in Central America already highly valued this substance, and that it had an immediately apparent, to somebody completely naive to it, physical and psychological benefit, as probably would any other caffeine-containing beverage, because, you know, caffeine was a new substance in Europe at the time, and cacao does contain caffeine. But so it had immediate apparent value. Deeper than that, though, what's interesting, if we go a little bit further back, you can see on the iconography on many of the sort of statues and friezes and sort of carvings and whatever, that cacao pops up in all sorts of sort of murals and on pottery and whatnot. And there are several associations that I go into in the section of the book on the mythology, where it's associated in the Mexica or the Aztec mythology with the southern direction. So all the Central Americans had a sort of the four directions were really important. Side note, this, for anyone who is interested in this, it's sort of called the perennial philosophy now. This idea that many ancient civilizations, sometimes on entirely different continents, evolved very similar metaphysical models for explaining reality, and that has been labeled the perennial philosophy, things which have these, and of course you can explain it or explain it away in a Jungian sense by saying, oh, it's the collective unconscious. For somebody like myself, who's slightly more, and I suspect you too, Anna, who's slightly more esoterically minded, I suspect that it's probably because there's a deeper truth at play that humans are trying to explain, and they all arrived at from separate locations and times in history and whatnot. Anyway, so the point is that the Mexica and the Maya and many other, because and by the way, the Maya were not one group, they were many different groups of people that have been collectively labeled the Maya by sort of historians and anthropologists and stuff, because they were sort of occupied the same region and had similar cultural tropes, but actually lots of different cultures. The Mexica were broadly one culture towards the sort of just before the conquest. Anyway, so we're talking about several thousand years of different cultures which had somewhat similar and overlapping belief systems, right? Just to be clear, it's not like one thing or two things, it's many. But all of those indigenous cultures in Central America had this idea of the four directions, and very like the Norse model of reality, where you have this world, the underworld, and the sort of other world, the sort of higher, the above, where we are in the middle, and the below. And they had, like, I think if I remember it correctly, I often get the numbers wrong, but I think they had 13 levels of the above world, of the other world, and 9 levels of the underworld. And they had this idea of sort of souls continually being recycled between the worlds. So you know, if and there were certain, like, in different religions, you had different things that would get you a pass to one of the nice heavens in the upper world, and different things that would get you sent down there and whatever. But there were lots of interesting ideas, which some of which I discuss in the book. But the interesting thing is, cacao in much of the iconography was associated with the southern direction, which was the direction of the underworld. It's direction of going into the underworld. And there are several, there's, like, for example, at Chichen Itza, the famous sort of like just post-classic, but I think it's built in about, I think, 1100 AD. Post-classic, no, it's called post-classic. It's just after the main Maya civilizations all seem to collapse or gradually fall apart around the 9th century. And then you have these sort of syncretic cultures which had a bit of Maya and a bit of some other influences coming in. So Chichen Itza is a very famous archaeological site in Central America, which is post-classic. There's a temple there called the Temple of the Owls, which is a temple dedicated towards underworld deities and the ancestors and stuff, because the owls, as in Europe, again, perennial philosophy things, ideas that are common to different cultures, because they're nocturnal birds, they're often associated with the underworld. And the Temple of the Owls, on either side of the doorway of the temple are two, what they call, not plinths, no, just the bits either side of the door basically are stone things carved to look like cacao trees, and cacao trees are very distinct because the pods grow directly off the trunk. It's a form of growth that botanists now call cauliflory. Don't know why it doesn't look like a cauliflower. I'm sure there's a Latin reason for it, but anyway, the pods grow directly out of the trunk. And when cacao trees were initially illustrated by Europeans, and those illustrations came back to Europe, European printers and people copying their work used to think they'd made a mistake and sort of auto-correct the pods onto the branches of the trees. So, like, because they thought, oh, this can't possibly be a thing, but no, the pods actually grow straight out the trunk. So these carvings at Chichen Itza on the doorway of the temple, this underworld temple, are cacao trees, and out of the bottom of these trees are carvings of two ancestors who are speaking, and you can see this on the carving because they have speech scrolls coming out their mouths. That's how they're indicated as speaking. And the discs, and there are little discs carved on the trees, and discs were the way that the Maya of Chichen Itza represent, and many of the classic Maya represented things of high value, because the little disc carvings were jade discs like that, and jade was the most precious substance in Central America. So it's like these trees are of high value, associated with the underworld, and ancestors are emerging from them. And then there's some earlier classic Maya pottery showing similar things. You've got, on the classic Maya pottery, you've got a picture of a cacao tree with there's a god seated and some little minion grinding chocolate at his feet, passing him up and touching the chocolate, and a cacao tree, and there's a shaman standing to the right of the cacao tree raising an ancestor from the bottom of the tree. So there's a few other little things, like there's codices with pictures of temples with cacao pods growing out the roof with blood dripping from. The interesting thing here is there's a consistent sort of through line of cacao being associated with ancestors and the underworld. And I think, hypothesis, because so much of this is speculative detective work, and I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a herbalist, so my main focus in the book is on the pharmacology and on its medicinal uses, on the properties of it, but I'm also an astrologer and I'm interested in the metaphysics of it and all of that. So but a lot of the sort of research into the mythology and all this sort of what I've cobbled together from different archaeological sort of resources. As it's all referenced, it's all like, you know, credible archaeological work, but it's just trying to put things together. It seems to me that it was a tree of the ancestors, and that it was seen as a sort of a substance which might enable or facilitate the opening of portals between the realms, which was the function of shamanic ceremony. So let me give you some examples as to why I think that, because so in much of the Maya region, they and I don't know which language this is, because as I say, the Maya, many different cultures, several different languages. Even today, there are 42, I think, different Maya dialects, some number in the 40 region anyway. But they had a belief in broadly speaking, that there was a sort of, as did many traditional cultures, again, perennial philosophy, there were three parts to the soul, which is incredibly interesting because that very much mirrors the ancient Greek concept of the soul. But you had a part of the soul which resided, I think, in the liver, which a part of the soul which resided in the brain, and a part that resided in the heart. And the heart, they were given different names in different cultures. The brain bit was the bit that went traveling as an animal while you slept. The heart bit was the bit that gave you your vital spirit and your personality. And the liver bit was the part that governed your desires. And this is fascinating because this maps not exactly, but very similarly onto the ancient Greek humoral idea of the soul, where the liver ruled the natural virtues and the mind had this function of imagination. Mercury, the sort of the bit that coined the images and enabled you to communicate with the above and below. And the heart has the vital spirit in it, which is the essence of you. So it's fascinating, completely different continent. Anyway, the point this with reference to cacao is that the point of ritual was to try to draw down sort of spirit stuff and make it sort of, so they saw spirit as being present in the blood, and sort of an essence of the ancestors was present in the blood, which some of the Maya called chulal, and that could appear as clouds or mist. And then that in ritual could be densified, drawn down, like to precipitate into a liquid form. And this liquid form was known as its. So it's kind of like life essence stuff, which was also present in the human blood and contained the essence of the ancestors, which could be drawn down in ritual into a concentrated liquid form. And you could see this was thought to be very present in natural materials which changed state, which went from liquid to solid. So blood was one of those materials. Tree sap was one of those materials that was very concentrated in life essence, that caused it, that was really concentrated because it resins. Think of resins, blood. I think so. Blood, resins, semen. I think sweat and tears to a lesser extent, and cacao and chocolate. Cacao was seen as a substance that was naturally replete with this life force, with this sort of energy. And I think that's in part because, you know, the seeds, when you grind them, they go to liquid, and then that liquid congeals, and then when you ingest it, I mean, this is a very rationalist explanation for what,
it is,
why they...
sense, and it's making me think about resin. So many sacred oils are resin, frankincense.
Yes, and it's fascinating because, I mean, again, we're for all that obviously you and I are both, and I assume most of this audience will be kind of esoterically minded or open to those to more a more vitalist or less materialistic worldview, let's say. We are brought up in a culture which is very top down, which is very analytical, which values detaching oneself mentally from the, you know, I think therefore I am, the separation between the mind and body and all that. So we do think that way. So I'm aware that every time you explain something, in a sense, you are explaining it away, but it's still fun, and I think it still has value.
Well, we're wanting to understand what the mystique around cacao is.
Yes, yeah. So and I think it's I love it, because I think it's you're looking at things through different windows, different vantage points of the same courtyard, right? So
fascinating, because it's the heart of herbalism, is understanding that there is a significance to plants that pertains to the body.
yes,
and it goes way back, and you've brought in parallels to ancient Greece, which is, of course, you know, the heart of medical astrology as we practice it in the West.
yeah.
And we're seeing these themes coming across. Of course, we're talking about Central America, so we're talking about something that's indigenous to South America and Central America. So it makes complete sense that the culture in its spiritual and healing practices would be making use of the plants. So you've answered that beautifully, because you've said, well, you know, this is what we know. It's linked with the underworld. There's something here, and this is the function that it
Yes.
had.
I mean, there's loads more, Anna. I mean, there's so many more angles. I mean, cacao was obviously, it was drunk secularly. It was very region dependent. Just to sort of go off piece slightly into the history for a moment, I'll come back to it. But it was very regional. So like the Mexica, the Aztecs, because they didn't live mainly, their heartland was not in a cacao growing region. It was imported. It was very precious. So for them, the nobility, it was restricted to just the nobles, and it was used as money. So for a poor person to drink, it's like literally drinking your money. So they didn't, and it was actually officially restricted to nobles. In many of the regions where it was grown, like on the east coast of sort of Guatemala and parts of Mexico, sort of Tabasco and sort of little bits of Guatemala, but just right at the top of Guatemala, and then more so on the west coast, the region called the Soconusco, which is sort of part of present day South Mexico, called Chiapas, and then a lot of the west coast of Guatemala, I think just down into Honduras, like a lot of that, and it's Belize as well, not sure. Anyway, whatever. The point is, these growing regions, the Maya there would, you know, many of the Maya would have drunk it because they could grow it, right? So that if it grew, they could grow it in their gardens and they could all drink it. So there weren't restrictions on its use there. But wherever it was a precious and valued commodity. Obviously, it was valued more in those places where it was scarce or it had to be imported or whatever. But it was always sort of precious and valued.
So it's very interesting to see, because what we're seeing really is human nature at work, that wherever we are, whatever we have available to us, we tend to kind of operate in similar ways.
Yes.
So that's
could I bring it round to the plants though, Anna? I kind of like, I like a looking glass perspective on this one, you know, like me I'm basically a vitalist. I think that you know, my model of the universe, I do talk about models of consciousness a little bit. That's one of those little chocolate horse Trojan horse chocolate things I put in there. I can see that I'm sort of going between two models of consciousness myself. Like there's a few. The old school religious view was what's called substance dualism, and most traditional cultures have a substance dualist view. That, broadly speaking, that means there's two kinds of stuff. There's physical stuff and there's spiritual stuff. So that's substance dualism. That's like most beliefs in history. But then there's other models, like there's the idealist model, which is like there's only a giant mind and matter is an illusion. It's like we're in a giant hologram that is conscious. That's idealism, and I'm kind of drawn to that one, or possibly to the substance dualist model. That the contemporary 20th century Western, for want of a better word, model is described as physicalism, which is there's only one kind of stuff, and it's stuff. And there are other ones. So I broadly boil it down to mind before matter, which is substance dualist. Mind creates matter, and there's two kinds of stuff. Matter before mind, which is the physicalist, which is this physical stuff, and then that generates mind, which is kind of an illusion. And then there's mind equals matter, which is a modern version, which is called panpsychism, which is there's physical stuff, but everything physical has a kind of latent property of consciousness within it. And then there's only mind, which is idealism. So I go between there's only mind, or there's substance dualism, there's physical stuff and there's non-physical stuff, which is more the traditional vitalist idea, which that vitalism is also compatible with panpsychism, the idea that there's physical stuff which is latent consciousness within it, that's always trying to arrange itself into conscious arrangements of matter. So anyway, all of that consciousness related serial box definitions tangent to say that most traditional views would obviously not hold with the modern materialist view, and in fact many scientists are now moving away from that physicalist view, that there is only physical stuff. Or as Terry Pratchett, the author, put it, one of my favorite quotes, at first there was nothing which exploded, as an origin story for the universe, which I love. But anyway, the point is, in any other model of reality, it is entirely, it's not merely plausible, but it's likely that everything has some sort of consciousness attached to it, whether we are inhabiting a giant holographic consciousness that we are merely part of, whether everything has latent consciousness that's trying to arrange itself into conscious forms, or whether things have a physical body and then a non-physical aspect in consciousness, what the Catholic philosopher Teilhard de Chardin would have called the noosphere, what some modern esotericists call the astral realm, what traditionally would have been called the spirit world. That's the substance dualist view. All of this to say that for most plants, I think, have a form of consciousness. So we're very comfortable with saying animals, particularly with brains, have consciousness because they have some form of cognition that we can recognize. It's sort of anathema in much of science to say that nature is teleological, meaning it has purposes, it's moving towards things with a purpose. Whereas in just about any traditional culture you can name, nature is presumed to be teleological. The whole of the reality that we inhabit is presumed to be teleological. As I say, in any other model of reality other than the physicalist, which is now looking, by the way, increasingly improbable, because you hear scientists talking about quantum woo, like alternative people like ourselves as talking about quantum physics. We're not physicists, it's just woo. It's like, yeah, but you can't play that get out of jail free card indefinitely. The fact that when you look at matter at its smallest possible level, it reacts to you looking at it, is telling you something, whether you like it or not. Do you know what I mean? So it's anyway, the point about all of this huge tangent is the fact that this plays to my mind, very much into traditional belief systems and the idea that things had consciousness, and that when you interacted with a thing by cultivating it, by ingesting it, by having some kind of relationship with it, you are essentially two forms of consciousness interacting with each other. And it is a contemporary delusion to assume that we are the only ones with any form of, we're the ones with the consciousness who are interacting. No, this is actually an overlapping Venn diagram. So the plants are influencing us, and this can be seen because I believe that when you can see something on one level, you can observe it on multiple levels at the same time. You can see this on the pharmacological level, you can see this on the behavioral level as well. So like to give simple example, really crude examples, but I enjoy this. You say we're cultivating wheat, so we grow wheat, we are in charge of wheat. And yet we now know that obviously wheat produces little proteins that activate endorphin receptors in our brains and our bodies that give us pleasure. So it could equally be said, now that wheat occupies a large part of the world's surface, that wheat is cultivating us, that wheat, the organism, has co-opted human beings for its own dispersal and growth. And I think, yeah.
When
Anyway.
I read that, I couldn't stop laughing because it's absolutely true. And I thought, how did I not think of this? Because it's so clear that the plants are benefiting us because they're giving us something that we like, and therefore we then are protecting them. It's like aphids, isn't it?
Everything is symbiotic, everything is interdependent and interconnected, and obviously totally, so those things can go in multiple directions.
Ants farming aphids, because what the aphids produce, that sugary stuff,
the sugary secretion,
the sugar,
honeydew.
and they like them, so they protect the aphids and allow the aphids to feed on the plants. Now, and this is the bane of most gardeners' lives, dealing with ants that are farming aphids when we're trying to keep that to a minimum. Well, there's obviously other ways of doing it, but it's exactly that. That's what I thought of when I thought, oh,
that's a good, and I like the analogy, Anna. I mean, but the thing is, we're living in this networked world of complex systems interacting with each other in all these fractal ways. Some bits are going to be clashing and other bits are going to be connecting and supporting and whatever. So I love that honeydew aphid metaphor with certain plants. I mean, there are so many different sort of directions you can take that off in, but the basic premise there is that plants are interacting with us just as we interact with them, and we're assuming
that sneaky cow worming its way into our
well, is it? So, I mean, this is the thing. You've got different plants with different, clearly from the pharmacological properties of cacao, it's got all of these, like we know that cacao reduces, and there's some fascinating statistics that cacao reduces the risk of all-cause mortality by something, relative risk, I should say, not the overall risk. It's not the solution to living forever, sadly, but it reduces your relative risk of death, which means, all things being equal, it'll slightly reduce your risk of dying. Fairly significantly, it's by about 30%. That's not overall risk of death. Relative risk is compared to other things. So it's not like, you live 30% longer if you have a cup of chocolate every day. It just means you're less likely to die than if you didn't. 30% less likely to die than if you didn't, compared to other things that you might do, something like that. So it definitely gives it, and also like it probably amounts to an extra sort of year of life, and it reduces the effect of many carcinogens on the human body. It reduces your likelihood of developing cancer. It seems to significantly reduce the risk of developing heart disease or diabetes. There's evidence now to suggest that it reduces the risk of developing cognitive problems, so Alzheimer's, dementia, particularly vascular dementia. It certainly enhances pleasure responses. I regard cacao as a hedonic modifier. That's my little phrase for it. It's nothing so crude as an antidepressant, but it's an intention dependent mood modifier. In other words, from a couple of small human trials, they found that, and this is like, to anyone who likes chocolate, it's like, duh, really, are you shocked by this? But they did a little trial where they gave people like an apple to eat or a glass of water. These are two separate trials, but I'm conflating, but just for this ease of whatever, I list them and reference them in the book, whatever. But they're only small trials. But there was a glass of water, dry cracker, eating an apple, or eating a chocolate bar. And the common thing with all of those is that the only one of them that raised the mood was the chocolate, but it only raised the mood when it was eaten mindfully. Now, the others, it didn't matter whether you ate them mindfully or not, the mood was not massively different either way. But with cacao, if you ate it mindfully with intention, then the mood was significantly better. But if it was not eaten mindfully, the mood didn't improve. So
Well, it's very simple, isn't it? You savor it, you enjoy
yes,
it.
yes, you savor it and enjoy it, but then
That's
there's a whole bunch of chemical cocktails very carefully manufactured by that plant that you can rationalize away by saying, well, these are anti-feedant compounds, these are compounds that are insecticide, or they're compounds used for hormonal signaling within the plant, except that we now know that this was what was commonly used in sort of standard science as pharmacognosy, the study of medicinal products from medicinal compounds from natural products. This was used to rationalize the existence, or to explain the existence, of secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites was a group of compounds that were named and labeled secondary metabolites because they weren't sort of seen as primary metabolites, like that were involved in energy pathways in the plant. So they were secondary, and they were thought to be like byproducts. And then it was realized that a lot of these products were really expensive for the plant to make. They took a lot of energy. So it's thought that, oh, these products are going to be antifungal or antiviral or and of course a lot of them are. And you find a lot of these compounds very, in high levels in a lot of medicinal plants. Then it's been found that a lot of these compounds have no recognizable function in the plant, but are extremely medicinally useful to animals or humans or other plants. Why are the plants producing these compounds? Plants have been on this planet for far longer than any of us mammals and whatever have. Why are they manufacturing these compounds? Could it be that we're inhabiting the same? Now, you could explain this from a purely dry evolutionary standpoint, but you'd have to go around some very tortuous bends in order to do that. To me, it's much more simpler, Occam's razor, to go, the plants are producing these compounds because they are interacting directly with us. We can give you something.
And actually, you only need to look at the relationship between plants and some species of animals, and birds particularly, to see that there is a relationship that's evolved between them. Mistletoe and mistletoe thrush, for instance.
Yes.
Mistletoe thrush play a hugely important role because it's by eating the berries of the mistletoe and going through the digestive process of the mistletoe thrush that the seeds become viable.
Right,
And
exactly.
it's absolutely needed. So it makes complete sense. Marcos, you and I could talk for centuries, I think.
I think that's entirely possible. Yeah.
But I think I'm going to leave our audience to learn more about the delights of chocolate, all the philosophies that we've been kind of exploring conversation, and the exciting prospect of plants farming us by reading your wonderful book, The Secret Life of Chocolate. I will put a link to that in the description box, along with your website, if people would want to learn more about you and what you do. So thank you very, very much for your time today.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. Lovely to speak to you as usual. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. And next time, we're going to be looking at somatic wisdom and spiritual awakening. Until then, goodbye.